I still remember the smell of lavender in the halls of Golden Sunset Care. It was my parents' pride and joy, a place that felt more like a home than an institution. They had poured 20 years of love, sweat, and savings into transforming our childhood house in Pinecrest Valley into a warm, welcoming haven for the elderly. My dad, a retired physician, handled medical routines with a soft steadiness, while my mom, once a nurse for 3 decades, offered a gentleness you couldn't fake. Residents came not for luxury, but for dignity. Home-cooked meals, game nights, a backyard garden where Mr. Wilson grew tomatoes, and Mrs. Cooper read under the old maple tree. But outside that peaceful haven lurked something more toxic than old age or illness. The Homeowners Association. They called it the board, as if they were some divine council. But at the head of it all sat Mrs. Jenkins, cold, precise, and as immovable as the marble lawn statue she kept. If my parents built Golden Sunset Care on compassion, she ruled the neighborhood on control. At first, it was little things. A letter about excessive vehicle presence on the property. A complaint about non-uniform landscaping. Petty stuff. But behind her tight smiles and HOA envelopes was something far more calculated. Across town, Mrs. Jenkins' son, Derek, had just opened a state-of-the-art elder care facility. Cold, corporate, sterile, and 3 times as expensive. When Derek first approached my parents to relieve them of their burden, offering to buy the property at above market price, they politely declined. Twice. The 3rd time, he stopped smiling. "I hope you won't regret this," he'd said. Turns out, that wasn't a warning. It was a prophecy. Within weeks, the HOA's pettiness mutated into a campaign of calculated attrition. Inspectors showed up unannounced, measuring our grass blades with rulers, photographing a barely visible crack in the sidewalk, even issuing a $200 fine because a hummingbird feeder wasn't approved. The fines added up like bruises. $75 for Mr. Wilson's wooden wheelchair ramp, $350 for unauthorized porch furniture, Mom's wicker rocking chair, $500 for an empty delivery box left on the porch for oxygen tanks. Mom tried to keep smiling, but the lines around her eyes deepened every day. Dad quietly stopped talking about expanding the West Wing. Instead, he spent more time sitting in the garden, staring at the soil. "They want to bury us," I said one evening as we read the latest violation notice. And they're not even subtle anymore. I was a paralegal at Thompson and Hart, not a litigation expert, but I knew enough about paperwork to see this was war in slow motion, death by bureaucracy. Still, my parents insisted on hope. We've got the permits, the licenses. We're doing nothing wrong, Dad said, holding up a manila folder like a shield. But I could see it in his eyes. The shield was paper. The attacks were steel. The 3rd offer letter from Derek came gift-wrapped in smugness. We're willing to offer 20% above market. No conditions. Immediate close. It wasn't just a number. It was a message. Give up. You won't win. Maybe we should consider it, Mom said one night, nursing a glass of wine after another HOA fine, this one for ambient noise during bingo night. I stared at her. "You want to let them win?" "No," she said, almost whispering. "But I don't want to watch everything we built die in slow motion either." I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about Mrs. Cooper, who had been with us for 5 years, who said she'd die if she had to go to a cold facility again. I thought of Mr. Wilson, who called Dad Doc with the kind of reverence reserved for old war buddies. I thought of how Derek smiled when he said we'd regret it. Then a letter arrived. No signature. No return address. Just a single line typed in bold. "Sell now, before it gets ugly." I walked into the next HOA board meeting like a soldier entering enemy territory. The room was antiseptic. 7 board members in identical blue blazers sat behind a long folding table. Mrs. Jenkins at the center, flanked by 2 lackeys. Derek sat in the back, casually scrolling through his phone, not even pretending to be uninvolved. I brought everything: building permits, community testimonials, a letter from the mayor praising Golden Sunset Care as a model of neighborhood integrated elder care. It didn't matter. I was halfway through my presentation when Mrs. Jenkins tapped her pen. "We've heard enough," she said, lips thin. "The board has already voted." "What?" I turned to the others. "When was this vote?" "Last week," said one of the men, not meeting my eyes. "But we weren't notified." "Golden Sunset Care," Mrs. Jenkins continued, ignoring me, "is in violation of covenant rules. Commercial enterprises in residential zones are strictly prohibited. You have 30 days to cease operations." "We're not a business," I snapped. "We're a home. These people aren't clients, they're residents." She stared at me without blinking. "Regardless, we expect compliance." I looked around the room. No one spoke. Even Derek didn't look up. The verdict was passed. The execution was coming. The hammer didn't fall from the courts. It came from a wrecking ball. I woke one morning to a low rumble, like thunder, but angrier. I ran to the window just in time to see a massive demolition crane turn the corner onto our street. My heart froze. Within minutes, the front wall of Golden Sunset Care exploded in dust and brick. A wrecking ball had just smashed through our living room. I screamed, barefoot, running toward the crew. "Stop. There are people inside." The operator hesitated. Mrs. Jenkins stood behind a barricade, holding a clipboard. "It's a legal demolition," she said coolly. "We have court orders. You can't do this." She held up papers I couldn't see. Foreclosure. Emergency demolition due to structural safety concerns. This property belongs to the HOA now. "No, and oh, we have residents in there." "Correction," she said with a satisfied smirk. "We had residents." Behind me, I could hear Mr. Wilson's wheelchair scraping down the hallway. I turned to see all 8 elderly residents gathered on the lawn in pajamas, shivering in shock. Each swing of the wrecking ball shattered more than wood and concrete. It shattered lives. And in that moment, I knew something else had just crumbled too. My patience. Dust still hung in the air like a ghost of the home we'd just lost. I stood beside Mr. Wilson, both of us staring at the splintered remains of Golden Sunset Care. His trembling hand clutched the wheel of his chair, his voice just above a whisper. "What do we do now?" "I find you somewhere safe," I said, my throat thick with grief. "Then I find out what the hell they're really up to." I moved quickly, driven by fury disguised as purpose. Within hours, I'd managed to get the elderly residents temporarily housed in the local community center, an echoey, impersonal space filled with collapsible cots and donated blankets. Not a home, not even close. But it was all I could do. The wrecking ball had taken the walls, but the injustice had lit a fire. Tanya arrived that evening, legal files in one hand and rage in the other. Her heels clicked across the floor of the community center as she took in the sight of displaced seniors eating canned soup under flickering fluorescent lights. Her expression hardened. "We're burning them to the ground," she said, "not the building, the system." And I believed her. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, document trails, and whispered conversations in quiet corners. Tanya and I worked around the clock. She leveraged her network at City Hall. I dug through every zoning ordinance, every bylaw's revision, every HOA meeting transcript I could find. What we uncovered wasn't just procedural irregularity. It was a rot beneath the surface. The board hadn't held a proper vote before issuing the demolition order. Mrs. Jenkins had signed documents on behalf of absent board members. The demolition company had been paid in advance, before the supposed court order even existed. And worse, the foreclosure was fake. A $25,000 special assessment fee had been applied retroactively and labeled unpaid within a 48-hour window. That alone was enough for Mrs. Jenkins to claim a lien and push foreclosure through with a forged internal resolution. It wasn't just malicious. It was calculated. "This isn't negligence," Tanya said, her eyes scanning one of the forged signatures. "It's premeditated fraud." But it wasn't until I found the old financial records that we struck gold, or rather, blood. Derek Jenkins had wired $15,000 directly into the HOA account 3 days before the demolition. "Here's your motive," I whispered. Tanya stared at the screen, her jaw clenched. "They tore down your parents' life for a goddamn deposit. We needed more, something undeniable. That's when Mrs. Thompson came forward. Her mother had been one of our residents. She lived across in the HOA office, and one night, her security camera had caught a strange scene. Mrs. Jenkins meeting Derek in the parking lot, accepting a thick envelope, followed by a long embrace. She handed us a memory card, fingers trembling. "I thought it was just odd," she said. "Now I know it was evil." The footage was grainy but damning. The envelope, the handoff, the secretive meeting. It was enough to scream collusion to anyone with eyes, combined with a bank transfer and forced foreclosure. Tanya had the bones of a legal case that could dismantle the entire HOA. But there was still one problem. Time. Court hearings, injunctions, motions. They would take months, maybe years. Our residents were homeless now, and the HOA still operating, unscathed, smug behind their rebuilt office doors. That night, as I lay awake in a borrowed cot in the community center, I stared at the ceiling tiles and realized the truth. Justice is slow, but revenge is instant. Derek pushed me over the edge. He showed up the next morning in a brand new black SUV, cruising past community center like a vulture circling a wounded animal. He lowered his window and grinned at me. "Nice setup you got there," he sneered. "Still need beds? I've got space. Premium rates apply, of course." The audacity made my blood burn. Later that night, I sat in my room staring at a set of keys I'd hidden in the bottom drawer of my sock cabinet. The keys to an old bulldozer I'd bought in a construction equipment auction 2 towns over. It had started as a joke, a fantasy, a way to feel powerful again when everything else felt broken. But now it felt like a plan. I unfolded the property maps Tanya had helped me obtain. The HOA office sat just 2 feet inside a boundary line that technically didn't belong to them. County-owned land, Ms. recorded during a zoning update. If I bulldozed it, it would be gray area, legal ambiguity, the kind that makes prosecutors sigh and juries hesitate. Still, I hesitated. I wasn't a criminal. But then I got a call from Mrs. Cooper's daughter. Her mother had collapsed in the community center bathroom. She'd been placed in a low-income care facility across town. She hated it. She cried every night, asking for her garden chair, the same chair that had been crushed under concrete when the wrecking ball swung. I didn't hesitate anymore. The sky was moonless, perfect. At 2:40 a.m., I pulled up to the HOA office in the bulldozer, heart pounding, hands trembling. No lights, no patrol cars, just silence and stale air. I took a breath. Then I hit the throttle. The first crash was euphoric. Glass exploded outward. The roof cracked. The alarm wailed into the night, but I didn't care. I hit it again. And again. This is for Mrs. Cooper. I drove straight through the lobby and circled the building like a shark in murky waters. This is for my parents. Wood and drywall shattered under steel. This is for every resident you made homeless. When the building finally began to collapse in on itself, I didn't stop. I pushed the debris into a neat pile and pulled out the final pieces of my plan. Quick dry cement, line paint, and a sign I'd made days earlier. By the time the sun began to rise, the HOA office was gone, and in its place stood a pristine slab of concrete with painted lines. At the entrance, the sign stood proudly, Golden Sunset Care Visitor Parking. And just like that, I drove away. No fanfare, no confession, just satisfaction. By sunrise, the world had changed. Birdsong returned to Pinecrest Valley, innocent to the war that had played out in its heart. But the rest of the neighborhood wasn't so lucky. The HOA board members arrived one by one, expecting to unlock their front doors, sip burnt coffee, and plot their next petty vendetta. Instead, they found a perfectly paved parking lot with white painted lines and a wooden sign declaring it property of Golden Sunset Care. The looks on their faces, I was told later, were priceless. I wasn't there to see it. I was already home, pretending to sip coffee at our kitchen table, heart thudding behind a mask of calm. Then came the first phone call. "You might want to turn on the news," Derek's smug voice said through the receiver. "Your little stunt won't last long. My lawyer's filing paperwork to block your rebuild permit permanently." I didn't respond. "Oh!" And I bought the land next door. Parking garage coming soon. Looks like your dream just got buried under concrete. I smiled slowly. That's funny, Derek. I think you're going to be too busy to build anything. He hesitated. What's that supposed to? I hung up. Seconds later, my phone buzzed again, this time from Tanya. Turn on the news. You're going to want to see this. Reporters, DA's office, police. Everyone's outside the new HOA parking lot. Justice was coming, and it didn't walk. It arrived in news vans and unmarked patrol cars. The chaos played out like a scene from a courtroom drama, except no one was acting. Live on Channel 7, Mrs. Jenkins appeared red-faced and screeching at reporters, calling the parking lot an act of terrorism. Her voice cracked under the pressure, her eyes darting to Derek, who stood stiffly beside her, sweating bullets in his overpriced suit. Then she made a fatal mistake. "They're the criminals," she yelled, pointing toward our house. "They ran an illegal business. That's why we tore it down." The crowd hushed. One of the officers slowly stepped forward. "Ma'am, are you admitting to ordering the demolition of the nursing home without due process?" Derek's face drained of color. "She doesn't mean that." "Yes, I do," Mrs. Jenkins snapped. "That place was lowering property values. We had every right to remove it." And just like that, she confessed on live television. More police arrived. 2 detectives exited a black SUV, walked calmly past the cameras, and approached Derek. "Mr. Jenkins, we have questions about a series of financial transactions between you and the HOA account." His mouth opened, but no words came. Mrs. Jenkins shrieked something unintelligible and tried to pull her son away. Reporters followed in a frenzy, camera flashes exploding like lightning. By afternoon, both were in custody. Corruption, fraud, illegal demolition, elder abuse, financial misconduct. The charges stacked up like bricks in a wall they built themselves. And now it was collapsing. The scandal rocked the county. Golden Sunset Care was no longer just a story of injustice. It became a symbol of resilience. National headlines carried our name. Interviews aired across networks, and the court of public opinion had made its decision. We were the victims, and we had fought back. The county commissioner himself showed up at our doorstep within days. "I'd like to apologize personally," he said, shaking Dad's hand. "We'll expedite the rebuild permits. Whatever you need, we'll make it happen." The new HOA president was sworn in, a soft-spoken veteran named Mr. Thompson, whose own mother had been displaced by the demolition. His first executive order? Permanent authorization of Golden Sunset Care as an essential neighborhood service and community partner. His second? Grant of official parking easement rights to the lot formerly known as the HOA office. That's right. The parking lot was now ours, legally, permanently. And thanks to Tanya, who discovered the HOA office had been accidentally constructed 6 feet over county land. It turned out the HOA never fully owned it to begin with. Talk about poetic justice. But justice wasn't done with Derek yet. Investigations into his elder care chain unearthed horror stories. Overmedication, neglect, hidden fees, forged medical reports. Several families had lost loved ones to inadequate care. Lawsuits stacked faster than Derek could lawyer up. Eventually, the county seized his facility under emergency order, and a nonprofit transformed it into affordable senior housing, the very opposite of the elitist empire he'd tried to build. Meanwhile, Mrs. Jenkins was banned from serving on any homeowner association boards in the state. Her home, once the crown jewel of Pinecrest Valley, was quietly sold in a foreclosure auction to pay legal fees and restitution. The old guard was gone, and the neighborhood, once ruled by fear and favoritism, finally began to heal. We rebuilt Golden Sunset Care brick by brick. Community volunteers helped repaint rooms. Mr. Wilson's son installed a new garden path with solar lights. Mrs. Cooper returned to her favorite window seat, watching the birds like nothing had ever changed. But everything had. 1 week after reopening, we held a small celebration, just residents, staff, and a few neighbors who had supported us through the firestorm. Mrs. Thompson sat beside me under the garden pergola, a slice of carrot cake in her hand. "You did a good thing," she said quietly. "I bulldozed the building." I replied, only half joking. "No," she corrected, smiling. You bulldoze a lie. Sometimes you have to break things to fix them properly. That stuck with me. Justice doesn't always wear robes. Sometimes it wears steel treads and leaves cement footprints behind. And sometimes the most powerful tool isn't a wrecking ball or a court order. It's the resolve to protect what's right, no matter the cost. Mom brought out a tray of tea, and Dad cracked a rare smile as he helped Mrs. Reynolds settle into a recliner. Golden Sunset Care was more than restored. It was reborn, with stronger foundations, clearer purpose, and a story etched into every beam and window pane. As I looked toward the horizon, I saw the old HOA office lot bathed in sunlight. The sign still stood tall. Golden Sunset Care Visitor Parking, a symbol of what had been taken and what had been reclaimed. And as I turned back to the laughter and clinking teacups, I realized something else. Sometimes karma doesn't just come around. Sometimes karma needs a little push from a bulldozer.